This week, of course, Donald Trump summoned Benjamin Netanyahu to Washington for a meeting on Monday that left everyone, including the Israeli prime minister and his officials, wondering what it was all about. Ali, let's talk a little bit about this. The leaders held talks at the White House, and after Trump's officials announced that a press conference by Netanyahu and Trump after the talks would be canceled, the two appeared before the cameras in the Oval Office anyway and answered a select number of questions. Trump did most of the talking during the nearly an hour of the press conference. I think we have a video, and then Elliot. Let's talk about your analysis of this.
Yeah, there's a few clips. Let's take a look at the first one.
Steve Witkoff was President Trump's very able representative, helped us get a deal that got 25 out. We're working now on another deal that we hope will succeed. And we're committed to getting all the hostages out, but also eliminating the evil tyranny of Hamas in Gaza, and enabling the people of Gaza to freely make a choice to go wherever they want. I mean, they should have that choice. And the president put forward a vision, a bold vision, which we discussed as well, including the countries that might be amenable and are amenable to accepting Palestinians of their free choice if they choose to go there. And I think that's the second thing that we discussed. But the hostages came right on top.
Free choice of expulsion from your homeland. What if they have the choice to go back to their lands from where they were expelled? Is that part of the choice? No.
This is like literally what our colleague David Sheen has been saying for many, many years, that Kahanism has completely, it wasn't necessary for a Kahanist party to beat Likud because they've just completely taken over Likud.
Yeah.
You know, this was always what Rabbi Meir Kahane always said, that it would be a voluntary emigration of Palestinians.
It's not ethnic cleansing if it's voluntary.
It's voluntary, but then if they choose not to go, they're going to be expelled anyway. So this is the exact same logic.
Yeah, well, that's not surprising. But what I did think was notable there, and that appears throughout the press conference, is that both Netanyahu and we'll see Trump doing this in a moment, did confirm that there are still efforts to achieve a ceasefire. So, and to square the circle of getting rid of Hamas's so-called tyranny. And over recent weeks, we've seen them stepping up these efforts we talked about a week or two ago to AstroTurf, anti-Hamas protests in Gaza. But I take that as an admission of failure, that once again, an admission that Netanyahu's so-called military pressure to force Hamas to surrender has failed. And we saw that since March 18th, the horrific massacres, more than 1,500 people killed since March 18th, and hundreds on that first day of renewed mass bombing, failed to force Hamas and the other resistance factions to surrender to Netanyahu's and Trump's terms. And here they are back trying to negotiate. That in itself is notable. Of course, the real bombshell that was revealed here in this press conference was Trump's declaration that the United States and Iran are in direct talks. And let's listen to that second clip of Trump talking about that.
We're having direct talks with. Wait. We're having direct talks with Iran, and they've started. It'll go on Saturday. We have a very big meeting, and we'll see what can happen. And I think everybody agrees that doing a deal would be preferable to doing the obvious. And the obvious is not something that I want to be involved with, or frankly, that Israel wants to be involved with if they can avoid it. So we're going to see if we can avoid it. But it's getting to be very dangerous territory. And hopefully those talks will be successful. And I think it would be in Iran's best interest if they are successful. We hope that's going to happen. And we had just a lot of good talks on a lot of.
Yeah, so those talks are supposedly going to take place in Oman on Saturday and will reportedly involve Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff and Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. I thought that we'll talk more about this. We'll come back also to some of the points that John made in his segment regarding wider regional war. But let's just go into that next clip where Trump talks about the ceasefire. He's asked a question by an Israeli journalist and about getting the hostages or the captives out.
Israelis are watching you now on live show. What is your specific way of getting the hostages out from the horrific captivity?
We are trying very hard to get the hostages out. We're looking at another ceasefire. We'll see what happens. But we want to get the hostages out. The Israeli people want the hostages out more than anything. They want the hostages out. This man is working very hard with us to do that. I mean, I don't know. I hope he's being appreciated because he's been a great leader. He's working very, very hard on the hostages and many other things.
So that's Trump praising Netanyahu for working very hard with us. But again, Trump saying that we're looking at another ceasefire. So again, admission of failure that opening the gates of hell, as they called it, has successfully murdered hundreds more children, but not moved the needle on their goals. And I think I want to do, we'll do all the clips. So we have one more clip, and then I want to make a few points, and we'll open up the discussion. So why don't we look at this last clip, which also ties together sort of the Gaza situation and the broader regional issue.
Thank you for the chance. Many of Palestinian Americans who voted for you and not for Biden because you've promised them to end the war in Gaza.
Very honored by that vote, too.
The war is still going on and there's no hostage deal. Do you have any update on that?
Well, I'd like to see the war stop, and I think the war will stop at some point that won't be in the too distant future. Right now we have a problem with hostages. We're trying to get the hostages out. We got quite a few of them out, but it's a long process. It shouldn't be that long. We have a big problem that we've done. I think I'll ask Pete to maybe talk about it for a second, because a lot of people are asking. The Houthis, we've been very tough and very successful militarily. We've really damaged them badly. These were people shooting down ships and other things, by the way, flying objects like airplanes. And we've put a major hurt on the Houthis, which nobody's been able to do. We've really hit them hard.
So there's a couple of things there. We've had Trump saying several times that they want a ceasefire and they're working towards it, and he hopes the war will end soon. Those are significant changes from the February 2nd press conference when Netanyahu was last in the White House, when they were talking about opening the gates of hell, and Trump's posts on social media threatening the entire population with Gaza. They're still murdering people. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But that tone has changed. They seem to have recognized that they're not getting anywhere with that. And Trump saying what Israelis want most is to get the hostages out, and they're certainly not getting that by bombing them and risking killing them. Now, on Iran, let's go back to that. These negotiations are going to happen, and how I read that is that probably, I mean, certainly the United States has recognized that war with Iran would not be a very straightforward thing. And let's see, that it would not be a very straightforward thing, and that it would be not a certain victory, that the stated goal is to destroy Iran's nuclear program, but probably the goal of the neocons and the people who have been pushing for a war with Iran for literally decades is more than that. It's a regime change, maybe reproducing the Syrian scenario and hoping that Iranians will rise up. There have been reports, again, these reports circulate in the media that they want to decapitate Iran and even take out its leadership and do what they did in Syria. It seems like they've realized this would be very, very costly and not secure. And the Iranians, who clearly have a capacity to retaliate against Israel and the United States, we saw that on October 1st when they fired hundreds of missiles at Israel. It was an incredible sight, which I saw with my own eyes. I talked about that on this program. And they could mount an even bigger response. But even for Iran, war is very costly, very risky for the world economy. If Iran were to block shipping, to hit oil facilities in countries where the US has bases, major risks. So they both have a big interest in avoiding war. And I just want to, John, you mentioned that story in the New York Times about the US strikes in Yemen burning through munitions with limited success, which, you talked about. But as if the point wasn't clear enough, that was on, I believe, April 4th. Another story was published in the New York Times on April 8th. And let's take a look at that one. U.S. strikes in Yemen, U.S. commanders worry Yemen campaign will drain arms needed to deter China. And let me read you a few sentences from that. American military officials say the Pentagon might need to dip into stockpiles in Asia to replenish supplies in the Middle East, congressional aides say. U.S. commanders planning a possible conflict with China increasingly concerned that the Pentagon will soon need to move long-range precision weapons from stockpiles in the Asia-Pacific region to the Middle East, congressional officials say. That is because of the large amount of munitions that the United States is using in a bombing campaign in Yemen ordered by President Trump. U.S. readiness in the Pacific is also being hurt by the Pentagon's deployment of warships and aircraft to the Middle East after the Israel-Gaza war began in October 2023 and after Houthi militia forces in Yemen started attacking ships in the Red Sea to support the Palestinians, the officials say. By the way, in parentheses, a rare acknowledgement there of why the Yemeni forces are attacking ships. The American ships and aircraft carriers, as well as service members working on them, are being pushed at what the military calls a high operating tempo. Even basic equipment maintenance becomes an issue under those grinding conditions. And then they say later in the article, several Trump aides, including Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Elbridge Colby, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, have said that the United States must prioritize strengthening its forces in the Asia-Pacific region to deter China, which is rapidly building up its military and its nuclear arsenal. And then finally, those officials argued that U.S. arms support for Ukraine in its defense against Russia and decades of military campaigns in the Middle East and Afghanistan have siphoned off important resources from Asia. If Israel attacks Iran's nuclear enrichment sites in the coming months and ignites a wider Middle East war, the Trump administration would almost certainly commit more U.S. resources into the region. Now, that article was that the same day that Netanyahu and Trump met? So I think the message here is very clear, both from that chaotic press conference with Trump and from what the U.S. officials are signaling in the New York Times, is that Israel is a distraction. Israel is a burden. Israel is a sideshow to the US's real target, which is China. And we see that reflected in the trade policy, where Trump almost crashed the US financial system with his tariffs. He eased back on the tariffs against every country except China, where he increased them to 125%. So it seems that this administration is bent on targeting China, which they see as their main superpower rival. And the message to Netanyahu is like, you know, we love you. You're our favorite little genocidal settler colony, but we don't have time for you right now. And we don't have the resources to spare. And we certainly don't want to start a major war with Iran. I'm not saying that could not happen, because the parameters Trump has set for successful talks may mean that an agreement is not possible. So Trump may have cornered himself into a war with Iran. And I have a couple of other things to say about that, but at this point, I want to hear if Nora, John, or Ace, if you have anything to add at this point.
Yeah, well, the thing that I said in the resistance report is that they're fighting Ansar Allah alone. They're firing more munitions, more vertical launch munitions than they make in a year. So, and there's no end in sight to this battle in the Red Sea, because they're not going to defeat Ansar Allah. I read from Abdel Malik al-Houthhi's speech. They're whatever the opposite of giving up, that's what the Yemenis will do. And we have a decade-long, and al-Houthi pointed out, we have a decade-long empirical evidence of that, because they were bombed 25,000 times in a decade by the US-Saudi war. And before that, going back to earlier in the show, the global war on terror after September 11th involved airstrikes in the hundreds in Yemen, covering the decades before that war, the Saudi-US war. So they've been fighting America. America's been attacking Yemen since 2002. So they're not going to be surprised by what's going on. They're ready for it. Their missiles that they develop are they could develop them relatively quickly, and they're in protected underground mountainous region that a ground force isn't going to work. So there's not really many options for the Americans here.
Yeah, I not much to add. I just wanted to say, yeah, it's really interesting how even the New York Times was kind of forced to admit that that the U.S. might have to dip into its stocks, in its various military bases around Asia. I just and the Houthis, the Ansar Allah, are not backing down, as John said.
And for as much as Trump is bragging about we destroyed this, we destroyed that,
Yeah.
the bottom line is, as John said, ships aren't going up into the Red Sea.
Right.
And the port of Eilat,
Right.
as Miko Peled reminded us, still completely idle and empty.
Yeah.
So by the measure they set of forcing Yemen to back off and to allow the shipping to go through, they failed. And they'll continue to fail by the looks of it. And clearly, one of Netanyahu's goals was to, and this was, trailed in the Israeli press in the days before his visit, that because Trump put a 17% tariff on Israel. It wasn't the highest, but it was more than the UK, which was 10%. And, they were surprised that Israel should be treated like that when its economy is already a mess. No slack was cut for Israel in the whole tariff thing. So Netanyahu wanted to go to Washington. He preemptively said, Israel, we're going to lift all the tariffs on the United States and go there and give this as a gift to Trump. And I think he was hoping that Trump would announce, we've made our first trade deal with our good friend Israel, and we're going to roll back the tariffs, and Israel is our best friend, and we want to do that with everyone else too. Come talk to us just like Israel did. Well, let's look at what actually, and in his opening comments in the press conference, Netanyahu did all this thing about the tariffs. And of course, this is before Trump's U-turn yesterday. But let's look at how Trump responded when he was asked about whether he would lift the tariffs on Israel that day, which he didn't do. But let's look at that clip.
Plan to reduce the tariffs that your government put on Israeli goods, 17%.
On where?
On Israeli goods, the 17%. Do you plan
Well,
to
we're
reduce
talking
it?
about a whole new trade. Maybe not. Maybe not. Don't forget, we help Israel a lot. You know, we give Israel $4 billion a year. That's a lot. Congratulations, by the way. That's pretty good. But we give Israel billions of dollars a year. Billions. It's one of the highest of, and we give a lot of countries money. You wouldn't believe if I said we give Afghanistan a lot of money, didn't it? Because that was a Biden deal, another Biden deal. Not only did he embarrass us with that, but they give them billions of dollars, Afghanistan, right? So, but no, we take good care of our friends and we don't take care of our enemies. We're not taking care of our enemies anymore, but we do take care of our friends.
So that was pretty funny. It was like, not only did he not take the tariffs off, but it was to remind us, like, we already give you billions of dollars. And then to compare Israel to Afghanistan as another, like, you know, country ripping the United States off with billions of dollars. I don't know what he's talking about there. But the point is, he didn't, you know, say how happy he is to be giving them all that money. It sounded kind of passive aggressive to me.
Yeah.
But that, again, you know, doesn't sound like there's a lot of enthusiasm. And then finally, in terms of the Iran, you know, because before this meeting, there was a lot of speculation among regional commentators around the world. Is Trump inviting Netanyahu to Washington for them to put, you know, the final flourishes on their joint plan to attack Iran? And what it seems like is that Trump summoned Netanyahu to Washington to tell him, we're not in the mood for this right now. You better chill out. And and then yesterday, Trump was asked about this again, and his comments were carried by the Associated Press, which reported that President Donald Trump said Wednesday that Israel would be the leader of a potential military strike against Iran if Tehran doesn't give up its nuclear weapons. And he says Trump made the comments ahead of this weekend's scheduled talk involving U.S. and Iranian officials in Amman. And then this is the quote from Trump, quote, "If it requires military, we're going to have military. Israel will obviously be very much involved in that. They'll be the leader of that, but nobody leads us, but we do what we want to do." Doesn't sound like the U.S. wants to spearhead a war against Iran on behalf of Netanyahu.
It
Again,
doesn't sound very enthusiastic at all. I mean, that's a way of saying you're on your own almost.
Yes. Now that's just, again, we're reading what they're saying and what the mood is. That doesn't necessarily tell us what they'll end up doing, because Trump may corner himself into it. But there are signs here that they're not too enthusiastic. And remember that in the leaked signal chat, we discussed this with Helena Cobban a couple of weeks ago. The Vice President J.D. Vance was saying, why are we doing this? He didn't have the honesty to say we're doing it for Israel, but he claimed we're doing it for Europe. The U.S. has no interest in bombing Yemen. So they may have the same view about Iran.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep reading that as well as we can. It's always very hard circumstances to try and pull the threads of what's real and what's, just Trump talking from the top of his head.
Yeah, I mean, one more thing on this, because I was discussing with one of our mutual friends about the whole tariff thing. What does that tell us? Trump did this massive tariff thing, which was bound to be economically disastrous for the United States and many countries. And as that disaster started to unfold, he kept insisting, I don't care. I'm going to do it. I'm not going to make a U-turn, until he made the U-turn pretty quickly, which also many people, was no longer surprising at this point. He's predictably unpredictable. Had he not made that U-turn, you could have said Trump is someone who is willing to pay a very high price, even if it's damaging to the United States, to get what he wants or get what he thinks should happen, which would have been very bad news for Iran, because, it would have sent a signal that he's willing to pay the price of a war with Iran. But the U-turn tells us that Trump is susceptible to costs. And so I'm not trying to predict what will happen here. That would be foolish, especially with someone like Trump. But I think the key takeaway here is that the U.S. is not in as strong a position as it wants to project.
Yeah, if we want to take the sort of optimistic view, it could be that, they will go back to some sort of ceasefire. There is still the talk of the ceasefire negotiations. And, I think the U-turn with the tariffs is a sort of example of that kind of possibility, where, the ending of the ceasefire, saying he's going to unleash hell and all of that, he could be viewing it as a way to sort of appease his supporters like Miriam Adelson, his Zionist supporters, the pro-Israel, the very wealthy Israel lobby funder who we've talked about in the past. And then going back to this, the ceasefire negotiations, not the ceasefire process, the indeterminate way to mask and continue the genocide, but the actual ceasefire that we did have for 2 months. Yes, of course, during that 2 months, Israel violated ceasefire. There were still killings going on, but at least there was some respite from the full-on genocide that we're seeing now. Again, it's Trump, so it's hard to say, but we'll see what happens.